We're going to talk about evolution, and I've put the key terms that we need to insert into an answer for an exam question on the right hand side, and these are the terms that I'm going to be describing as we go through. The thing about evolution is it's always the same. It is always these 5 things that happen which lead to evolution. So no matter what the characteristic, which means the feature of an organism, the change will have occurred by this 5-step process. And then, if there was going to be a number 6, it would be over a long, long time. The changes in the whole population would happen, so that you would have either a new feature or even a new species. So, number 1, random mutation. Well, evolution always starts with a random mutation. And a mutation means a change in the DNA. And so DNA is a double-stranded molecule that's found in every one of your cells in the nucleus. And the DNA is a recipe that tells your cells how to make a you. Or the DNA of a tiger tells the tiger cells how to make a tiger. And the DNA that you have, or a tiger has, or any organism has, comes from its parents. And so for us, for example, we have our DNA in 46 chromosomes. And they are arranged in 23 pairs, and we get 23 chromosomes from our father and 23 chromosomes from our mother. A tiger will have a different number of chromosomes. And a chromosome is a strand of this DNA. On the chromosome will be specific sections which code for a characteristic. So on this strand of DNA, this particular section here might code for eye colour. And lined up against that, eye colour. And we call a version of a gene an allele, which I mention over here. So DNA controls your characteristics. So a mutation is a change in the DNA. So can you say here that I've got some DNA here, and if the eye colour for this section said blue eyes, if I was to change this DNA, then I might change it to green. And you would have had a mutation, a change in the DNA. So, what does this mean? Well, a key word here is random. Every one of your cells has 46 chromosomes. That gives you all of the genetic information for your body. And then when you become sexually mature, if you are a man, you produce sperm. And these sperms have 23 chromosomes in them. And if you are a woman, in the ovary, you produce eggs. And these eggs have 23 chromosomes in them. And these two will come together in a process called fertilization. So where can a change of DNA happen? Well, in the process of making sperm and eggs, there's what we call a lot of genetic variation. And that means every sperm is different and every egg is different. And there can be just some natural variation, but there can also be, in the production of these sperm and eggs, a change in the DNA. mutations. But they're not controlled, and they are not designed. They are random. And you can understand this by understanding that when you are creating sperm and eggs, you are copying and dealing with billions and billions of molecules of the way that the DNA is made up. It's made up of what we call bases, and they are made up of letters, A, T, G, and C. And there's about 3 billion of them. And the process of separating them and making sperm and eggs creates the ability of mutations, of changes in the DNA. And just randomly, there might be one that comes to our second point, which is advantageous. I have to tell you, we have pretty good biological systems. So most mutations that happen in DNA are not good. I think 99.9% of them actually mess around with a system in our bodies, whether we be tigers or humans or plants, which work really well. But very occasionally, a change in the DNA will lead to an advantageous version. And that version of a gene is an allele. So let me just go into a little more detail here. We've got a chromosome here, one from dad and one from mum. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn these into giraffes. So daddy giraffe and mummy giraffe. And they have both got a gene that they donate here for neck length. And as a result of a mutation, let's say that the mum had this when she was making the eggs in the process of what we call meiosis. There was a mutation which kind of just changed the DNA on her chromosome. And it would lead to that change a very long neck. Now, if we think about evolution and we work backwards, there would have been an organism, and you're going to have to forgive my rubbish art here, that had a kind of longish neck. And then there was a random mutation, which meant that the neck became longer. Now, it doesn't take much to imagine, does it, that if you have vegetation and trees which are required to survive because you need to feed, that this organism with a longer neck has got an advantage. And so this version of the gene that the mother donated, which we call an allele, a version of a gene, is advantageous because it's given this organism a longer neck so it can feed. And particularly in times of famine or when life is really tough, this particular organism with that changed DNA, that mutated DNA, has got an advantage. And now we're off and running with evolution. Because if this longer-necked organism has an advantage and it can get food, it's got an increased chance of survival. And now, if it has got an increased chance of survival, it's got an increased chance of surviving to reproducing age, so it can have sex, and pass on this advantageous allele, or the gene, onto its offspring, which is the biological word for children. And so, we had an organism that had a neck that was shorter. And now, we've got some organisms in the population, once the offspring have been born, that have got longer necks. And then, over time, these ones that have the advantage survive. And the ones that don't may die off. And so in 1,000 years, you might only have the longer-necked organisms. And therefore, the shorter-necked are extinct, and these guys are surviving. Evolution is random. We might wait 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 1,000,000 years possibly, before another mutation randomly happens, which gives, could be in the father or the mother's DNA, that gives an even longer neck. And this is an advantage. And the whole process starts again. So this random mutation has given this organism an even longer neck, and this one has an advantage over the even long-necked, but not as long as this, has an advantage. They're more likely to survive, they're more likely to reproduce, they therefore pass on that advantageous allele, that version of the gene, to their offspring. And then over 1,000 years, the shorter neck ones die off, and longer necks survive. And that is the process. And over a long period of time, maybe millions of years, there's a selection, we say, for longer necks. And this would become, over time, a giraffe. So with evolution, there might have been a horse-like organism, which had a longish neck for a horse, but then over time, driven by the selection of having a longer neck to feed, the neck became longer and longer, and we ended up with a giraffe. Key points. Every time it followed the same pattern. A random mutation, which is the change in the DNA, which led to an advantage of survival because of this random version of a gene, the allele, random advantage of that allele, which increased the chance of survival, which increased the chance of reproduction, which would then be passed on to the offspring so they could survive. And that is the process of evolution. But just to prove the randomness of this, I just want to take this one stage further. Imagine if, 50,000 years later, there's another random mutation and the neck becomes even longer. This is beginning to look a bit like a diplodocus now. But there is a hugely long-necked giraffe. Now, we might think, oh, well, longer is better. But hang on. This is a random mutation which needs to be advantageous for this organism to survive. Just think about the complexities here. This may not be advantageous to have a neck that's too long, because if we have a very, very long neck, the brain is all the way up here. So we need a massive heart that can pump blood all the way up to the brain. That involves a lot of muscle. It involves a lot of strength in the arteries and the veins to withstand the pressure required to get it up there. You're going to have to invest loads more energy in bone and cartilage and muscle to hold the neck up. The neck might be too cumbersome. It might be prone to break. If this organism tries to run away from something, might it be that the neck is too long and too unwieldy and it flips and breaks? And so I just want to prove the point that evolution doesn't have a design. We might have a giraffe or a long-necked organism that produces one randomly that's too long, and that one would be selected against, because long doesn't necessarily mean better. Long, to a certain extent, would be better if it allows feeding without changing everything else. And so you can see that evolution, what we call, hones in on the best characteristics for a given habitat. And it's the same for all species with all their characteristics. So a polar bear might have 10 million years ago been slightly grey. One day there was a random mutation in the polar bear's DNA. It was an advantageous allele because that version, giving a white coat, gave it an increased chance of survival.